Before we begin, I want to let you know that this episode contains a description of torture. It's the middle of the Troubles, 1982. More than 100 people will be killed this year, and the IRA will set off bombs in London's royal parks. Soldiers can be seen marching through the streets of Northern Ireland, armoured vehicles crawling through rural towns. A big part of the military effort is unseen, happening in drab, backroom offices at the Army's headquarters just outside of Belfast, Thiepval Barracks.
It's a typically civil servant anodyne building.
Ian Hurst works for the head of the army in Northern Ireland, who has a plush military office. But Ian's outside in one of
2 porter cabins stuck on top of one another. So we were just as an add-on. And it was, carpet that had been there for maybe 20 years and it was rancid. Downstairs, underneath us, we had the rat hole.
The rat hole. It sounds shabby, but it's home to an elite team, a section of the Force Research Unit, or FRU.
If the rat hole asked us to do a job, we would do it. We were aware it's like the Premier, yeah? It's like, you're in League 4 and you want to get in the Premiership.
Ian's ambitious, and he offers to help the rat hole whenever he has a chance.
They were a very small organisation. They clearly couldn't man their telephones 24 hours a day. Your only job is as a secretary, for want of a better word.
Ian's happy doing night shifts, monitoring the phone lines to earn credit with the rat hole. On one of these evenings, he's with his colleague Sam when the phone rings.
Sam took the call, and I was in the office doing some work.
A police officer's on the other end of the line with a request for the rat hole. They've got a man in custody who wants to speak to them. What were they being held for?
Drink driving.
The man wants the army's help to get out of jail.
And I took the call from Sam and pacified the police officer. He was a little bit juppity at this stage.
With the phone in hand, Ian's about to discover the rat hole's true purpose, operating the British Army's secret weapon in the Troubles. A double agent at the heart of the IRA. Codename, Steak Knife. Before long, the porter cabin is flooded with people. The emergency's so serious, the boss of the FRU comes back in, even though it's late.
And then the proverbial shit at that fan.
Ian's now the keeper of a dark secret, one the army wants to stay under wraps.
Both me and Sam were cautioned that we would be sent to some obscure region in northern Siberia if we talked about this.
I keep coming back to this scene. A chance call one night in 1982. The low-rung soldier who took the phone. And the chaos that ensued. Because it sets in motion a chain of events. Thanks to one person being in the right place at the right time, a chink has appeared in the armour of the FRU. The battle to keep the truth out of sight continues to this day, but with enough chinks, the full picture will start to emerge. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies, Episode 4, Touts.
This is what we call the centre of the city, more or less. A lot of the bomb attacks and whatnot took place in around this area here, a lot of car bombs.
A unique tourist industry has cropped up in Belfast. Troubles tours, which take place in retired black cabs.
So what we generally do here, we'll go up into the 2 areas which the conflict, where it started in up here. The Shankill Road is 100% Protestant community, running parallel with the Falls Road, which is a 100% Catholic community.
We've got a Nice bit of this Belfast rain hitting us. Shall we get in the car?
Anyway.
Driving across the city, you can see the division.
So this is the Shankill Road we've just come on to here.
It's a Protestant loyalist area, so there's lots of red, white and blue.
The Union flags are flying quite prominent here.
But today, it's the Catholic area of the Falls Road that I'm interested in. Because for the next stage of my investigation, I need to do a 180 and look at the IRA.
So we've now moved across. We're into the Catholic community. That's the symbol of the provisional IRA.
On this side, there are lots of Irish flags. The green, white and orange tricolour.
This gable end that we're looking at is the Sinn Féin offices, and on the side of it is a mural of Bobby Sands, who was involved in the hunger strikes.
On both sides, there are large murals like this one. Buildings painted with historic battles and tribal slogans. Some of them are designed to be aggressive, like one I spot. It's actually got two sort of militants there in fatigues with black balaclavas holding guns that actually they're almost sort of aimed at us right now.
Now, no matter where we move here, when I start to move the vehicle here, those guns will always follow you. You're going to get the impression that they're turning towards you as we move around. Okay?
That's quite intimidating.
Well, that's the idea behind it. It's letting you know who is in control, really. I mean, keep watching the guns as we move here, the guys with the guns here.
Bit like a sinister Mona Lisa. On the Republican side of town, I've been speaking with former IRA fighters. There's Ricky O'Rourke.
I was born into the Lower Falls in Belfast, which is a
Anthony McIntyre.
I went into prison at 16, came out at 18, went on again at 18.
And Danny Morrison.
Bit of an IRA history with an uncle of mine who had been sentenced to death in the 1940s.
They're in their late 60s and early 70s now, and have all become writers. I should say, they don't all like each other, and have fallen out at various times about the direction of the IRA, so they might not be happy about me running their interviews together. Sorry. But their accounts corroborate one another. Ricky, Anthony and Danny joined the IRA as teenagers. They were from Republican areas and learnt from the adults around them.
In those days, the pubs all closed at 10 o'clock. So you'd have seen them coming into our house with their wee crates of Guinness. They got me out of bed to sing fucking songs, traditional Republican songs.
Then, the Troubles kicked off at the end of the 1960s.
The biggest influence was probably the repression of the civil rights marches.
You gradually got absorbed into Republican activism. It seemed the natural thing to do.
The British were seen as foreigners. They were seen as an occupying force.
Soon after the British Army arrived, the Republican movement split. Younger people criticised their elders for not fighting back. So the militant Provisional IRA was born, known as the IRA, or Provos.
Most Provos had one political belief. That is a united Ireland. Subsidiary of that is that the British have no right to be in Ireland.
Ricky and Anthony tell me about joining the IRA. They were each taken to the back room of a house for the ceremony. A leader opened with a stark choice.
Any of you can walk out the door now, and nobody will think any of the worst of you. But if you stay, understand this, you will be in jail or you will be dead. Those are the only futures that you have.
We had to write out a statement as to why we wanted to join.
And then she says, okay, well, put your hands up.
Make all sort of promises of fidelity to the IRA in Ireland.
And what happened after you joined?
Well, I was an IRA volunteer. I'm not going to go into details of what I was doing. But let me say, I did what volunteers did. I fought the British.
The IRA's fighting involved shootings, robberies, and bombs across Northern Ireland, England, and the Republic of Ireland, killing more than 1,800 people.
You never seen it as morally wrong, you seen it as an ethical response as far as you give consideration to ethics.
Ricky and Anthony both ended up in prison. Ricky for bank robbery and Anthony for being a member of the IRA and murder. They both got involved in high-profile prison protests, like those where inmates didn't wear clothes or wash, smeared excrement in their cells, and went on hunger strike. After leaving prison, they drifted from the IRA. Danny rose to Director of Publicity for the Republican movement. He's still close friends with Gerry Adams, the former president of Sinn Féin, and is perhaps best known for coining a phrase that captured their strategy.
We can wage an armed struggle with an arm light in one hand and a ballot paper in the other. So that is armed struggle, electoral struggle. They can complement each other.
In this culture of tribalism, of deep-set generational divisions, the people with the worst reputation were those who straddled both sides, who betrayed the IRA and spied for the state. Like in criminal gangs, people who gave information to the police and army about the IRA were seen as the lowest of the low. You might know them as snitches, informers, or spies, but in Northern Ireland, they're known as touts.
A tout within the IRA would be viewed much the same way as Jimmy Savile is viewed within the British establishment at the moment. As a veiled creature, somebody not to be touched with a very long pole.
I despise and detest informers because of what they have done to our struggle.
They were scum. As far as I was concerned, informers were scum.
Ricky's wife, Bernadette, adds,
A paedophile would have a higher standing. It's just a word that I absolutely detest in this place.
why is that?
I think it's just the way Northern Ireland is, and that it's part of our psyche now, that if you open your mouth and say anything, you're classed as a tout.
Where's it come from?
Fear. The word tout brings fear.
This fear and hatred comes from a deep paranoia. The IRA were up against a formidable enemy, the British government, which included the police, army, MI5 and MI6, who were all trying to gather intelligence from inside the IRA to stop bombings and other attacks.
Did anyone ever approach you to try and get you to inform?
Yeah, of course. A special branch man who's dead now offered me money when I was 19.
Danny says the police officer from Special Branch had coaxed him.
You know, you can have a good life and all that, and we'll protect you. You know, nobody will know. It'll just be between you and I.
Danny turned them down. He heard stories of other attempts to recruit people.
A friend of mine was approached in Madrid in an art museum. Two guys came up to him.
That's very Cold War novel.
Yeah. They approached him. They'd been following them. And they were trying to compromise him and recruit him. Obviously, they're trying to recruit people all of the time. Why wouldn't they?
In response to the problem, the IRA leaders decided to set up a new division. Ricky explains.
The Internal Security Unit was formed in 1978. At no time at all the press were aware of it, and they called it the Nutting Squad.
The Nutting Squad. Effectively, the IRA's internal police and executioners.
People started to be found on country lanes with 2 bullets to the back of the head or the back of the nut. Hence the term the Nutting Squad.
It's pretty dark. As Anthony says,
They weren't a group of people who were particularly well got or well liked, and there was always a sense of fear of them.
the IRA were always on the lookout for spies within their ranks. Whenever an operation went wrong, they would launch an investigation. Say a fighter was killed, a cache of weapons discovered by the army, or people caught by the police. Danny says,
Suspicion might fall upon somebody who's the common denominator in everything that's going wrong. It's the IRA that spots the informer. It's then that the IRA sends for Scapatici.
Freddie Scapatici, the head of the nutting squad. Known to most people as Scap, he was just over 5 foot tall, with stocky shoulders and a black moustache. Looks he got from his Italian dad.
Swarthy, dark hair.
When Anthony was a young IRA fighter, he worked with Scap. What was he like?
Well, Freddie Scapatici was a senior figure, so when people like him come into a room, a senior figure, somber, serious, he had this aura. He had this aura of authority. He didn't wear the jeans and the stuff that we were wearing. I always remember him seemed to be somebody who was more like an office worker.
Anthony has a certain respect for Scap, because Scap helped him escape from jail after he was convicted for killing a loyalist.
When I had to go on the run, Freddie Scapatici was the person that got me down to the south. He arranged a lift after I had sort of absconded from the juvenile detention centre where I was held.
To most people, Scap was a violent thug. Ricky didn't know Scap personally, but he's interviewed a lot of people who did.
You looked at this guy and you'd say your overwhelming view of him would be, there's one cocky bastard. And that cockiness was tailor-made for the IRA. If he was in a fight, 9 times out of 10, he had a sock with a brick in it. He's a vicious wee guy.
Scap came from the hardened markets area of Belfast, but his family were pillars of the Catholic community. His dad had an ice cream shop, and his wife was devoutly religious. Together, they had 6 children.
His sons and daughters are very, very decent people, hard-working people, but he was in a fucking piece of shit. In every respect, his wife was frequently seen with black eyes.
Scap brought his violence to the nutting squad and developed its fearsome reputation. When a suspected informer was caught, Scap interrogated them. He described his method years later for a documentary.
Standard procedure is to strip them and debug them, right, just to see if they're wired up or whatever, right? And they usually put a boiler suit on them then after that, right? Put them in a chair facing the wall, right, and then go from there.
The audio's not very clear. Scap says he would strip them, check them for bugging devices, and put them in a chair facing the wall. Suspects were blindfolded, but they could often identify him by his thick Belfast voice.
Maybe the room's cold, they make you all sorts of promises, right? And everybody being what they are, everybody's a breaking point.
The squad was notorious for torture. Journalist Neil Mackay spent years covering them.
I've heard tapes of what happens to people when they are interrogated by the IRA, by Scapatici, and it's brutal. It's horrific. It was once described to me as, just imagine being stripped naked, beaten, and sat on an electric cooker to make you speak. I mean, this is ghastly medieval forms of torture. This isn't, nobody's messing around here, and you're going to die. You know, these people are left with cigarette burns and poker burns.
For them, torture was a question of needs must. They needed to catch spies, and this was the best way to get them to confess. Once they did, they were killed, then cruelly disappeared, buried in unmarked graves, or discarded in a public place to send a message.
Wrapped in black plastic and dumped up a country lane.
Stories about informers who'd been killed were common within the IRA, like a dark folklore that encouraged paranoia among fighters.
So yeah, I knew a few people who had gone that way.
A guy called him a Malloy. He denied everything. They beat him up.
Jimmy Young, who was shot dead in 1984, I knew Jimmy.
He was shot dead.
Charlie McElmurray, who was shot dead, I think, in 87.
Caroline Moorland was probably the most shocking for me. She was taken out and shot dead on the side of a road.
Jerry Allen said Mr. McElmurray knew that the penalty for informing was death.
The consequence for informing is death.
I asked Jerry Adams' friend, Danny Morrison, if he thinks informers should have been killed.
We join an organisation like the IRA, you agree to its rules, and its rules are that if you're compromised, You have to declare that right away to the IRA. But if you let it go forward in that, you're risking your life. How does an organisation protect itself unless it has these measures?
Ricky agrees.
Informers know exactly the penalty if they're caught. They had no sympathy for informers. If somebody was informing and they were caught, shoot them dead.
The people who fell foul of Freddie Scappaticci and the Nutting Squad weren't always IRA members. There are many tragic stories of people being killed, like that of Joe Fenton.
Joe Fenton was an estate agent who had a business maybe about 200 yards from here.
Here being Ricky's house off the Falls Road.
He had a three-piece suit and ginger hair and smoked a cigarette, and, real smooth guy.
When Ricky left prison, he asked Joe to help him move house.
He said to me, Ricky, I'll get you a house, don't you worry about it, son, you leave that to me, Joe'll sort you out. He's one of those guys that say, come on, we'll go for a pint. But so pliable too.
Joe wasn't in the IRA, but he was sympathetic to their cause, and he helped them every so often.
Somebody would have said to him, Joe, can you call around to such and such a house? There's a gun that needs moved for me to be, and he'd have done it.
One time in 1982, he agreed to move some explosives, but the police caught him.
And he was arrested with the explosives.
In custody, the police asked him if he'd be willing to gather intelligence on the IRA.
Spicer Branch put it to him, you've two options, you either work for us or we'll put you in jail for 15 years.
Joe reluctantly agreed to work for them.
But he was in a situation that he didn't want to be in.
Caught in the middle of the police and the IRA, Joe was now an eyes and ears spy. He wasn't an IRA member, but he was close to the action, close enough to know he was in danger. And so he put together a plan to escape, to get far away from Belfast with his wife and 4 children.
Joe had a clean record, so he went to the Australian Embassy in London and applied for a visa for himself, his wife and kids, to go and start a new life in Australia.
But Joe's handlers in Special Branch didn't want their spy to leave so soon.
They went to the Australians and said, you can't let this guy in, he's a terrorist.
With that, Joe's visa was rejected and he was stuck in Belfast. His handlers asked him to get even closer to the IRA. They helped him develop his business, Ideal Homes, so he could lend empty houses to fighters.
The IRA guys started using them more and more and more.
Little did they know, the police were bugging the houses.
They were putting cameras in the rooms where the IRA were having the meetings. This was the top IRA man in Belfast. So they were able to find out about IRA activity, about forthcoming operations.
The IRA began to suspect Joe after a number of operations went wrong. In 1985, Joe deflected a Nutting Squad investigation by giving Freddie Scappaticci the names of 2 other informers, husband and wife Gerard and Catherine Mahon. They were interrogated and shot dead together. Scap was off Joe's back for a while, but before long, Joe was back in the frame. More than 20 IRA fighters were arrested in possession of guns, and several bombing teams were intercepted on their way to launch attacks. By the summer of 1988, the Nutting Squad had concrete evidence against Joe. They'd found a weapon in one of his vacant houses that had clearly been tampered with by the Brits. Scap launched an investigation into him. In February 1989, a few weeks after lawyer Pat Finucane was shot dead by Loyalist gunmen, the Nutting Squad called Joe to a house in Lenadoon, West Belfast. He was nervous going in, for good reason.
Fenton was physically abused. He was beaten up.
And the person in charge?
Scappaticci was the principal interrogator.
Joe cracked under pressure and confessed to working for Special Branch. He thought this would save him. After all, he'd never agreed to follow the IRA's rules.
Not everybody knew the machinations of the Nothing Squad, and a lot of these people who admitted to being informers were fairly naive. They weren't knocking around the IRA long enough to know that once you tell them that you're an informer, that it's too late to retract, that it's over.
So it was for Joe.
And he eventually ended up getting shot dead.
Joe's body was discarded in an alley in Lenadoon. A shot to the back of his head had left him unrecognisable, and he had to be identified by his jewellery. He left behind his wife and 4 children. No one has ever been charged for his murder. At his funeral, the priest said Joe had been manipulated and crushed, and the IRA weren't the only secret death-dealing agents.
He was caught between 2 sets of vicious, unscrupulous men, one of which, as secret agents of the state, has a veneer of respectability on its dark deeds that disguises its work of corruption. We want the cancer of the IRA and their violence removed from our midst, but not by means that will leave the moral fibre of society damaged and the system unclean.
The Nutting Squad abducted and murdered more than 100 people it alleged to be informers. The squad was at large for more than a decade. But in 1990, its run would come to an abrupt halt. In a shocking twist, there was actually a spy within its ranks. More on that after this short break.
Hello, Claire Newell here, Investigations Editor at The Telegraph. I also sometimes host The Daily Tea Investigates, a strand of documentary episodes on another Telegraph podcast, The Daily Tea. For both Bed of Lies and the podcasts I work on, journalists spend months digging into complex stories, sifting through long documents to find the truth, and giving victims the space to tell their stories. And as a thank you for supporting our journalism, subscribers can binge this series of Bed of Lies now. For more information on how to connect your Telegraph subscription with Apple Podcasts, head to the link in the show notes.
In January 1990, a year after Joe Fenton's brutal murder, another suspected spy was being interrogated at the house in Lenadoon. The spy was face down on a bed in a dark room, stripped naked, with his hands tied behind his back. Sandy Lynch had dark brown hair and a moustache, like his interrogator, Freddie Scapatici. Sandy was an IRA fighter, but he was also a Special Branch informer.
We entered a room at the top of the stairs.
Sandy's words are being read by an actor.
The room was in darkness. I felt a hand in the back of my head. I was pushed down onto a bed and I heard a voice saying, "IRA security." I was searched from head to foot. I felt something which I believed to be a metal detector going over my body. I heard a voice. Freddie Scapatici said, "This thing was going haywire." He said, "The cunt's wired to fuck."
With Sandy stripped and blindfolded, a group of IRA fighters gathered around him for the interrogation.
One of them told me that he enjoyed his work and that he would break me. A voice said that the only way I would leave the room was to be taken out and shot for being a touting bastard.
The man leading the torture, Scap, leant down close to Sandy's ear and said aggressively,
"You know me, but I don't give 2 fucks, because where you're going, you'll not be telling no one. That I would wake up hung upside down in a cowshed, that he would skin me alive and that no one would hear me squealing. He mentioned my wife. He told me that she would be depressed when she had to come down and identify me.
Scap later said this was all to break Sandy.
See where people saying that they use a lot of violence? They don't really. Physical violence, they don't use. Now, they use mental violence, obviously. You know? It's a psychological thing, you see.
The quality of his interview isn't very good. He says he relied on mental violence rather than physical, and he applied psychological pressure. But Scap's threats to Sandy escalated even further.
He tapped me 2 or 3 times in the back of my head and said, "You'll get it right there." He said, "Like that bastard Fenton." He said that his people could only identify him by his jewellery, because he had been shot at the back of the head and he had no face. He said that he had done it.
Sandy couldn't take it anymore. He reached breaking point, like so many people before him. He admitted to being an informer for Special Branch. Scap applauded him for doing the right thing and told him to write a confession.
I was told that if I wanted to make a plea for lenience from the leadership, saying why I shouldn't be shot, to go ahead.
And think they're going to go home, but they don't.
The next day, it was a wintry afternoon in Belfast. Danny Morrison got word that he needed to go to a house in Lenadoon.
The message was that there was an IRA volunteer called Sandy Lynch who was prepared to do a press conference.
Sandy was going to record his confession, which the IRA and Danny, who was director of publicity, would then use for propaganda. Sandy was also willing to name
2 RUC Special Branch officers who were trying to set up for assassination a number of leading Republicans in North Belfast.
There is another theory about why Danny was needed at the house, which is that a leader from the IRA's 7-person Army Council had to deliver the death sentence to people who confessed to informing.
There's been a theory put out there that that's why you were on the scene.
Well, that was put to me in the doc. The fact of the matter is that the day, on the Saturday, my son Cameron...
Danny doesn't really answer my question, so I try again.
Yeah, so you were there for a press conference, not as a member of the Army Council.
No, I was there to... By the way, I was quite concerned that the guy was a lunatic who could be making all this fantasies and this, and I would be...
I try once more, explicitly this time.
Were you in the Army Council?
Pardon?
Were you in the Army Council?
Why are you asking me that? I thought we were finished.
No answer.
Why would I make a contribution to what the British government, the British Army, all want to establish about the history of the war? No. In fact, that's a very unfair question, given the basis of the interview.
So I don't get a clear answer. But to be fair to Danny, it's a pretty incriminating question. The members of the Army Council have remained secret to this day. So I drop it. Back on that wintry afternoon, Danny pulled on his gloves and went out into the freezing cold. He met his friend, Anto Murray, and they went to the house in Lenadoon where Sandy Lynch was being held. The address was on the back of Anto's hand.
As we were going through the housing estate, there was a car sitting outside a school with what looked like a curtain couple. And it sort of made me suspicious. It wasn't a normal place for a curtain couple to be. And I'd remarked upon it to Anto, and he says, "Well, sure, we're only a minute from the house."
But no sooner had Danny stepped into the front garden
when suddenly the jeeps were flying into the street in Saracen armoured cars.
Danny panicked. It was the army and police. He could be arrested or shot.
I decided I'm getting out of here. So I ran out the back of the house, and there's a British Army soldier hiding in the back garden. He called upon me to halt. I jumped over a fence into the next garden.
Danny pushed open the door and went inside.
A few minutes later, the RUC, the British Army, came in, and I was arrested.
As were most of the interrogators and the owners of the house in Lenadoon.
It was all over the papers and that, and I was called the IRA's Lord Chief Justice and the Reader's Digest and the Daily Telegraph, and all the papers, really went to town.
Sandy Lynch had a lucky escape. His handlers had raided the house before the nutting squad had a chance to kill him, saving him from the same fate as Joe Fenton. They paid for his relocation outside Northern Ireland and gave him a new identity. But in the raid, there was someone who was nowhere to be seen. Freddie Scapatici. Scap had fled across the border into Ireland. He was a wanted man.
So, Mr. Scapatici was offside at the time of the arrival of the security forces.
Kevin Winters was in the early days of his career as a criminal defence lawyer for Madden and Finucane. His boss Pat had been tragically killed a year earlier. Kevin was assigned to Scap's case.
I arranged to go down to Dublin to see him.
Kevin thought Scap had a charm to him.
Kind of an avuncular charm, I suppose, is one way to put it as well. And there was a presence to him.
The police had evidence connecting Scap to the scene of Sandy Lynch's torture. His fingerprints were on the battery of the debugging device, the one that went haywire.
That would have been a sufficient forensic link to Scapatici, to the house, and potentially enough evidence to charge him with offences connected to the detention of Sandy Lynch.
Scap hid in Ireland while the dust settled. But he soon grew bored of being away from the action, and his family were in Belfast. He chanced his luck and went back home, even though the police were still on his tail. Two years after Scap's co-conspirators were arrested, his lawyer, Kevin, got a call.
To say that he had been arrested, I think, off a building site, and I went to see him in Castlereagh.
A police interrogation centre. Kevin had good news for Scap. He'd managed to get an alibi from the owners of the house in Lenadoon, which explained why Scap's fingerprints were on the battery. It said he'd done work in the house earlier.
He was released without charge from Castlereagh Holding Centre.
Scap got off free. 8 people were convicted over Sandy Lynch's abduction and torture, including the other interrogators and the owners of the house. Even Danny Morrison.
I never met Lynch. He never gave any evidence against me.
Danny hadn't stepped foot in the house, and yet...
I was charged with kidnapping him, and I was charged with IRA membership.
Something didn't add up. In the wake of what's become known as the Sandy Lynch affair, paranoia was at an all-time high in the IRA. Rumours were swirling that there could be a spy within the nutting squad. At the same time, another event had set off alarm bells. Top Loyalist fighter Brian Nelson had been exposed as a spy for the army, for the Clandestine Force Research Unit, or FRU. The leadership of the nutting squad was toppled, and a new regime brought in. The question of a spy lay dormant for the rest of the decade. Until August 1999, a year after the Troubles had come to an end, the Sunday Times published a sensational story which claimed the IRA had been compromised right at the heart, that a high-profile IRA fighter had been a spy for the FRU, just like Brian Nelson. The spy was allegedly paid £80,000 a year, and the FRU had a whole unit dedicated to running him, that elite team based in the rat hole. He was, quote, Britain's most cherished agent, a man with the code name Steak Knife. The hunt for the top spy was on.
The name Steak Knife first cropped up very, very, very early in conversations with sources within the FRU.
Neil Mackay is a journalist from Northern Ireland. He lives in Scotland now for security reasons. He spent years looking into collusion, which led him to the FRU.
So one of the first stories that I did was to write a piece based on interviews with FRU officers, and the quote was, My unit was guilty of conspiring in the murder of civilians in Ulster on about 14 occasions. We were able to take out leading provosts with the help of the UDA. It was a great military coup.
Journalists like Neil were now as interested in who could be a spy in the IRA as fighters had always been. In particular, who was the agent Steakknife? There were years of speculation, and the guesses went all the way to the top of IRA leadership.
I'm not going to risk defamation here, but there had been a lot of talk about who it might have been.
Everyone had their own theory. Anthony McIntyre says,
People were speculating, was it Jerry Adams? Was it Martin McGuinness? Well, everybody, and they were all throwing all names in. You know.
In prison, Danny Morrison spoke to fellow inmates about who could be behind his conviction.
We then began to put together a jigsaw as best we could, and as far as I was concerned, that anybody who was involved in that house, but who wasn't there when the raid took place, had to be suspects.
And who was that?
It was several people who had been involved in questioning Sandy Lynch and bringing him to the house.
Neil had a source who knew the identity of Steakknife. Ian Hurst, the soldier who took that late-night call back in 1982 when he was working in the rat hole. The person the police had in custody for drink driving was Steakknife. And did you get their name at that point?
Yeah. Fred Scapatucci.
Ian was warned to never talk or think about Freddie Scapatucci again, but he was too curious. Back in 1982, he broke the promise to his superiors immediately. He and his friend Sam searched for Freddie Scapatucci's name in the military computer system.
Because we went Googling like mad. The equivalent of Googling.
So you're searching his name, and what sort of information comes up?
That it effectively was running the internal security unit.
Known as the Nutting Squad.
It dawned on me that we were handling the executioner for the IRA.
The IRA's top spy catcher was himself a spy. The former head of the Nutting Squad had overseen the torture and murder of dozens of people who were in fact just like him, spies for the British. The whole time he'd been working for the Fru. As the Nutting Squad shot 30 spies, Scap was there at the helm, directly involved in at least 18 murders. Ian kept the information secret for over a decade. But now the troubles were over, he became increasingly disgusted with Scap's brazen violence, and he felt it was time to expose what the Fru had done.
It was certainly an out-of-control agent, and the light suddenly dawned on me that this is wrong.
Ian became a whistleblower and told Neil Mackay the identity of Steakknife.
Receiving a name and publicising a name is a completely different kettle of fish.
First, Neil had to verify it.
Could you imagine being wrong and saying someone is the highest placed British spy inside the IRA?
Reporting on a clandestine world isn't easy. Soldiers in the Fru had signed the Official Secrets Act, and they were, by the very nature of their jobs, tight-lipped and manipulative.
What do you expect when you're dealing with military intelligence?
Some former Fru soldiers were candid with Neil. They wanted to get the truth out.
Some because they're disgruntled, some perhaps because their conscience was pricked, some because they saw the story starting to leak out.
Then there were those who tried to muddy the waters with conflicting details.
To sow disinformation. Now, these guys are spooks, kind of, so they need to get off on the cloak and dagger thing, Kind of maybe it's exciting to pretend you're blowing the whistle, to confuse the press, to play with the press, to toy with the press.
But at long last, Neil had a breakthrough. He got hold of Steakknife's handler.
This individual's now dead, and I promised him I'd never name him, but this individual directly handled Scapatucci for a long period of time.
The handler could tell Neil was going to out Steakknife eventually, and he was dying of cancer. so he agreed to meet Neil at a hotel in Manchester. They spent the weekend talking.
And I just, painstakingly took down the entire history of his relationship with Steak Knife.
What was your sense of him as a person? What was he like?
Well, if you've ever hung out with squaddies, he was like that. Macho, funny, witty, amoral.
Neil was surprised to learn that Steak Knife's handler wasn't from England.
This FRU soldier was Northern Irish, and he joined the British Army as a young guy. And because of his understanding of Northern Ireland, he ended up in the Force Research Unit and became direct contact point with Scapatici.
With that, the handler confirmed that Freddie Scapatici was Steak Knife.
There genuinely was an emotional attachment between the two. He was fond of Freddie Scapatici, as far as I could understand. He's the guy who had a nickname for him, Steaky.
But Neil had one more hurdle to overcome.
You need to take your findings to officials and say, we're going to publish this, what do you say about it?
For that first story Neil wrote about how the FRU had colluded in murders, he had to get comment from
the British government, the British Army, and everyone else who you're accusing of being up to their armpits in blood and murder to have their say. So you open up a avenue of dialogue with the intelligence services and with officialdom. It was quickly made apparent that any moves to name current agents would end up in an injunction, so we would not publish.
So began a new stage in the state's cover-up, of collusion and of their involvement in murder. Neil sat on his scoop for months, trying to figure out a way around the draconian rules. Eventually, he came up with a strategy.
The Sunday Herald had a sisterly relationship with a newspaper in Dublin called the Sunday Tribune. The threat of legal action only persisted in the British jurisdiction. It did not hold any water in the Irish Republic.
Once the name of an agent had appeared in a foreign newspaper, there would be little point in the government trying to prevent its release in the UK.
It's a real round the houses, up the trees and backwards cat and mouse game.
3 years after he first heard that Freddie Scapatici, former head of the IRA's nutting squad, was the agent Steak Knife, Neil had finally broken the news.
We had got told the day before, because Steak Knife's getting out of it. I said, who is it? And he said, Scapatici. And I said, fucking Scap.
Made sense to me.
Bump. Wow. He's been a tout all along. So the actual shock was incredible.
This guy was the top double agent, but he was interrogating and finishing off other agents.
Just like Brian Nelson, the loyalist spy, Freddie Scapatici was involved in systemic murders. A pattern had been exposed.
To keep your cover, you need to do the business of terrorism, which is killing.
Soldiers in the FRU had known all about the deadly actions of their agents. But just how guilty the handlers were is a question only they can answer.
Let's be very clear here. The British handlers of agents like Steak Knife knew exactly what they were doing.
Coming up on Bed of Lies. What was the culture of the FRU like?
Maverick. If you could defeat a terrorist act, they were quite happy for you to do anything you wanted.
We are colloquially known as the backstabbers.
When you're a member of a paramilitary organisation, you don't take your instructions from your handlers. You will be a model terrorist.
You can shove the greater good right up your ass. If it's your child, your mother, your father, you wouldn't pay that price.
Bed of Lies is written by me, Cara McGugan, and produced by Sarah Peters at Tuning Fork Productions. The executive producers are Louisa Wells and Adelie Pojman-Ponte. Script editing by Venetia Rainey. Fact-checking by Mick Brown. Sound design by Peregrine Andrews, with production assistance from Georgia Cohen, with thanks to Ryan Gudge, Louis Brady and Theodora Leludis. For more of my in-depth reporting, my book, The Poison Line, Life and Death in the Infected Blood Scandal, is out now with Penguin. If you haven't already done so, listen to the award-winning first 2 series of Bed of Lies on this feed, in which I investigate 2 very different scandals. A reminder that Telegraph subscribers can binge this series of Bed of Lies now. Tap on Already a Subscriber in Apple Podcasts to listen before everybody else. If you'd like to become a subscriber, the link is in the show notes for early, ad-free access. For everyone else, episodes will be released weekly.